More of the puzzle is coming together these days as we decipher who have been pulling the money and power strings at the Biden White House. And as we all know, it certainly wasn't Sleepy Joe. Arguably, it was Jake Sullivan, but, that's on the foreign policy side of things. With DOJ continuing to gloriously dismantle and expose USAID in its mission to make government more transparent about how your tax dollars are spent, the last administration has been under intense and beautiful scrutiny. And we're finding much. It turns out woke activist groups were directing and infiltrating the Biden administration in their policy agendas and using USAID as a cover. These groups were funded by George Soros through his Open Society foundations, the same Soros that Biden awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, of course. According to Congressman Scott Perry of Pennsylvania, USAID awarded, for example, a $2.5 million contract to Open Society for training in civic activism, engagement, and mobilization. According to the Daily Signal, Open Society Institute also funded these similar groups that steered directions for the Biden White House. And they steered directions according to such groups as the American Civil Liberties Union, which pushed open borders in the Biden administration, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and the Southern Poverty Law Center, which pushed for the weaponization of federal law enforcement agencies against conservatives. We saw funding being directed to the Human Rights Campaign, which pushed gender ideology, to the Sierra Club, which pushed climate alarmism. To break this down and get to the heart of the Woketopus is Tyler O'Neill himself, managing editor of the Daily Signal, author of the hit books Making Hate Pay and Woketopus. He's here to talk with us and lay out some of the latest headlines coming out of this dismantling. Welcome back, Tyler.
Thanks. So glad to be here.
Talk to us about what you have seen since we last visited with you. Last time we spoke with you, we were talking about the fact that these NGOs did wield immense influence inside the administration. But what has changed since we last spoke is now we're seeing exact dollar amounts. And we're seeing those exact dollar amounts through organizations that perhaps weren't even on our radar before.
Yeah, I think one of the big ones that needs to be on Americans' radar, and kudos to Glenn Beck for bringing this organization up a long time ago, but it's called the Tides Foundation. And this is one of the left's dark money apparatuses. And they have been funding the Southern Poverty Law Center. They've been funding many of the other organizations. They got at least $20 million from USAID. Now, of course, that money probably, that was going to external, outside the U.S. things. So I don't think there's a direct tie from USAID funding to the Southern Poverty Law Center. But the Tides Foundation is one of the big players in the left's dark money network. And they also have an in-house nonprofit called Palestine Legal that represents anti-Israel rioters when they face charges for the stuff that they've been doing on college campuses.
So layers after, as you say, there's no direct line to some of these things, but there's layers upon layers upon layers. And one of the grants will funnel it off to other grants, and that's how the connections are made.
Yeah, I don't know for certain where the money goes. See, one of the things about the Tides Foundation, they're really good at cloaking where their donors are sending the specific money. They do that through these things called fiscal sponsorships, of which this Palestine Legal organization is one, where you can give money to the Tides Foundation, and then that money will be supporting one of their fiscal sponsorships that prop up and do the actual work. Sometimes these fiscal sponsors, like there was one called Governing for Impact, which worked with the Arabella Advisors nonprofit, one of their nonprofits. I think it was New Venture Fund. And what would happen is the donors would give to New Venture Fund. The money would be siphoned to Governing for Impact. This new organization that barely existed, Governing for Impact, it had been around for maybe like 2 years, and suddenly it was advising really high up staffers in the Biden administration, people who were in charge of OIRA, which is, one of the central hubs of the bureaucracy. And of course, this is all a problem because our government has this massive fourth branch of government. If you were lucky enough to learn in school about our Constitution and the three branches of government, you need to forget a little bit of that, because we have the fourth branch of government, which is the vast bureaucracy, the administrative state. And it technically falls under the president, but it often does things that the president would not like. And what we see is a lot of this woke corruption at USAID and at many of these other agencies continued during the first Trump term, because Trump had been facing these deep state attacks. He didn't fully understand how deep the threat was. And so now, as he's coming in this second term, he is hitting it off at the head, all of these threats from the woke bureaucracy. And now the left is freaking out because they don't know what to do. They have to defend the corruption at USAID and say, oh no, how dare you slash funding for foreign agencies that are backing woke projects and, transgender operas in far-flung parts of the world. This is a brilliant move on the Trump administration's part, but it really highlights how deeply entrenched the woke elites have gotten, and why my book was so important to expose these activist groups.
Well, it's absolutely a necessary conversation. And when you've been raising this for years, and I think that for the most part, Americans were not ready to hear it because, one, we didn't know what to really do about it. We had lived for decades under a Washington, D.C., where concerns like this would be raised. And you're almost yelling into a void. None of these lawmakers wanted to really do anything about it. Now with DOGE popularizing the exposing of this kind of money funneling, if you will, more of the American public are awakened to what you've called the Woketopus. So with that said, doesn't that make the jobs of these NGOs, these mysterious organizations, doesn't that make it harder? Or, based on what you know, will they just stay put and wait to regrow once this administration is out?
So I think the answer is both and. And this is one of the things I've been talking about after the book came out with Trump and the administration. So a lot of these organizations are struggling. And we saw what I call the immigration industrial complex, where these are NGOs that receive almost, in most cases, at least half of their funding from the federal government. And they were moving illegal aliens across the country. Now, because Trump has paused the programs, they're filing lawsuits and going to court and saying, we can barely keep the lights on. And it's like, well, maybe that's the point. Maybe you shouldn't be able to keep the lights on. At the very least, can't we say you should be defunded if you are moving illegal aliens across the country? Like, this is the most basic.
No, I love that you brought that up. I mean, the Hillsdale model is the kind of the capitalistic model of NGOs, whereas the government subsidized version, which we see en masse, the vast majority of these NGOs are subsidized, are really carrying out the socialist agenda that allows them to exist. So you're right to point out the very system itself is wrong. And also, I know that great legal minds are already thinking about this, already fighting it, but there should be a very big question about how we're funding Catholic charities using grants and how that connects, how that may interfere with the Establishment Clause of the U.S. Constitution. But again, that's a deeper legal conversation. When it comes to the reaction from the swamp, I know you're in D.C., you're seeing some of it happen now. The reaction from the swamp is a lot of these NGO leaders and this class, they're selling out. They're selling their properties. We're seeing some reports recently that the DC market is exploding with homes being placed on the market. And I mentioned this earlier to you off camera. There's a phenomenal thread. This investigator goes through and starts dissecting these homes that are being listed. And a lot of them seem to be connected to people who are on boards of these NGOs. They're suddenly leaving. What does that tell you? If, in fact, they are leaving and selling these $1 million to $3 million homes, is that a hint that we are permanently helping remove them? Or again, is this just a dispersion question they're going to reorganize?
Yeah, I think it's very revealing. I think what we've seen is a lot of these same woke activist groups, the Woketopus, are filing lawsuits to try to
Hmm.
block Trump's actions in the courts. But the fact that so many of them are leaving, I think should be very
Yeah.
encouraging. It shows the American people that they realize Trump is effective and his war on the deep state is going to have good ramifications for the country and bad ramifications for those who've been on the take.
How important was it for these NGOs to physically be in DC?
That is also an excellent question. I think it is important for whenever you're trying to curry favor, whenever you're engaged in lobbying, whenever you want to be close to the people who are making these decisions, where the money goes. The location in DC really does matter. I mean, that's why you have K Street is notorious for being the street along which all the lobbying firms are. And of course, there are lobbying firms on L Street and M Street, but K Street is
Right.
notorious for a reason. And I think the fact that these people are leaving shows that they understand, at least for the next 4 years, they can't trust that their bread is going to be buttered in DC. And so maybe it makes sense for them. I mean, maybe it's a good idea for them to go and ask for private donors to support their causes. If their causes are so good, maybe you could get, and this is the thing, like I talk about George Soros, I talk about the Tides Foundation, I talk about Rockefellers.
Right.
These people have the right to give money to organizations. There's no need.
That's so much more work, Tyler. They're not
Yes,
used to that. Tyler O'Neill, senior editor at Daily Signal, always an illuminating good time to talk with you. Thank you for the visit, and we'll keep our eye on Zillow these days to see what else pops up on the real estate market.
That was wonderful. Thanks again for having me.
Is Europe's biggest threat coming from within, as Vice President Vance has said? Sarah Adams, former CIA officer and counter-terrorist analyst, joins us next and breaks it all down. We'll be right back.